Hello and welcome to Myth Monsters. My name is Erin and I'll be your host for these little snack bite-sized podcasts on folklore and mythical monsters from around the world. These podcasts focus on the actual cryptids, folklore and mythic monsters from global mythology, rather than focusing on the full stories of heroes and their big adventures. I'll also be dropping in some references that they have to recent culture and where you can see these represented in modern day content so that you can learn more and get as obsessed as I am about these absolute legends of the mythological world. I'm technically home from my holiday if you're listening to this on the day it releases, but I am travelling back home from Manchester where I took off from, so decided to record this one massively in advance so I don't have to worry about it. I can almost guarantee though that I'm sat on a train feeling very sorry for myself with immense sunburn, ginger problems indeed. We are going somewhere equally nice and warm this week too, to a mythology we've kind of touched on before, but not specifically. So come to Hawaii with me this week for the awesome little Menehune. The Menehune are described as short-statured, forest-dwelling dwarf-like creatures who looked like huge humans but were only 6 inches to 2 feet tall and much thicker in stature. That's thicker with 2 C's if you know what I mean. They were described as little people as they generally looked like shrunken down humans and would have whole communities of all genders in their groups. They lived in the forests of all the Hawaiian Islands, where they would live happy lives, cliff diving, dancing, singing, and playing instruments, usually undisturbed and unseen by humans. They are usually described as being muscular, with big eyes and eyebrows and protruding foreheads, whilst the female Menehune were often described as beautiful and voluptuous. They are entirely nocturnal creatures, and they generally didn't enjoy being out in the heat of the sun. In the nights, as well as their frolics at home, they used their amazing power. They were expert stonemasons, carpenters and engineers, and would craft incredible statues, monuments or buildings overnight. Of course, they were incredibly strong because of this and incredibly smart. They would do this for themselves and for humans, but would always disappear when the sun rose, work finished or not. Islanders could call upon them to help with this work by leaving 1 shrimp per Menehune as a gift. Their favourite food was bananas and fish, and they also had the skills to create magic arrows, which they would use to pierce the heart of angry people and turn the feeling into love instead, like mini cupids. But unfortunately, that's about all we know about their physical appearance and what they can do. We can only assume how they reproduce and how they die, based on the idea that they're mini humans, and that they reproduce and die just like us. What we do know though is that they are responsible for some of the most amazing structures within the Hawaiian Islands, and are still considered to be the creators of them to this day. For example, the Ale Koko fish pond on Kauai was built overnight by Menehune, according to legend, and is over 1,000 years old. They also built the Menehune Ditch, which is a historic irrigation ditch that funnels water from the Waimea River on Kauai too. I'll go into more specific stories around those massive, amazing structures later, but these are 2 incredible feats that are still attributed to their amazing building skills, even in the modern day, which is just amazing. Now let's hop on over to etymology. There are actually 2 translations for Menehune, which is usually a Hawaiian word, and can actually be linked to another word for them, Kama'aina, which means child of the land, or indigenous people. In Tahitian, another Polynesian island language from Tahiti, funnily enough, Menehune means commoner, and was a word used for the lowest class of labourers. Their history is also utterly interesting, because this isn't a place we've been to before with the podcast. And whilst Hawaii is technically within the US and is also within Polynesia, it's got its own folklore to separate itself from everyone else, which I absolutely love. However, this does mean that some of this has been lost, as due to tribal culture and a generally more isolated place before settlers from Europe came across, it meant that many died with this traditional story and monster in their minds, and in their culture but not on paper. So researching it is a little bit more difficult. It also means that officially, we know the Menehune have been around for at least 1,000 years to match the Menehune pond creation, as otherwise it just wouldn't have the name. But in writing, the Menehune was only found when the Europeans came in and wrote it all down, which was in 1853. This was by the Australian antiquarian Thomas George Thrum, who wrote Hawaiian folktales and talked about the Menehune being the original ancestors of the Hawaiian people and their culture, which predated all other Polynesian folklore. Many other missionaries came across to Hawaii throughout the 1800s and wrote so much about Polynesian and Hawaiian folklore, but no others mentioned the Menehune in their books. They were also missing in the original explorers and whaler logs from the 1700s, when Captain James Cook founded and that is in quotation marks, the island in 1778. But there could be many reasons for this, such as natives not telling missionaries about local beliefs, the loss of native people from European carried diseases, fairy tales brought across from Europe having a higher influence. That is just many of the reasons this could have been lost or just forgotten about. But also in Hawaii at this time in history, it was a little rough to say the least. It was officially founded by Cook in 1778, yes, but around this time when all of these missionaries were talking about this monster, it was around the 1860s. The Civil War in the US was in full swing, Hawaii declared itself completely neutral, and the first newspapers were established on the island, which is where this myth really kicked off. From 1875, the same Thomas George Thrum published his data on Hawaii and called Menehune a race of dwarves, industrious elves and little people. He even started to call himself the father of the Menehune because he loved the idea of them so much. It's repulsive, I know. Later, in 1891, linguist William DeWitt Alexander gave them magical building powers in his A Brief History of the Hawaiian People, and talks about all of the structures that had been attributed to them throughout history. Speaking of which, I did promise to tell you more about those too. They were discovered by the Europeans in the 1700s. The Menehune Ditch was found to have 120 perfectly etched basalt blocks to carry the water to taro farms. It's 24 foot high and can only really be explained as something magical, according to history. However, ancient Hawaiians were really talented stonemasons and probably did this themselves. The Menehune fish pond is definitely the same marvel. It's an 102 acre long pond constructed with a 2,700 feet long stone wall, and it does come from over 1,000 years ago. It's also packed in with a mud and rock structure that we've not found in any other Hawaiian ponds, and would require the workers to complete this underwater, which is why it is mostly attributed to the Menehune. There is a great folklore tale about this pond too, and it's that the pond was made for a princess and her brother that left them the shrimp they required. However, the Menehune worked in total isolation away from everyone else, and one night The siblings were curious and watched the thousands of Menehune work, and then they accidentally fell asleep on site. At sunrise, the Menehune found them and transformed them into two pillars that can be seen today in the mountains above the fish pond as punishment. As the Menehune were interrupted, there were two gaps in the wall, which were later filled in by Chinese settlers who wanted to raise fish, but found their stonemasonry was nowhere near as good. One last story about the Menehune was the three Menehune of Idaho, which is a forest on the island of Maui. The three Menehune were called Ha'alulu, Moloa, and Iliu, and all of the other Menehune knew them for their fantastical powers. Ha'alulu means to tremble, and he always appeared to be shivering cold, but his magic gift was that wherever he went and he would start shaking, he would become invisible and could travel anywhere without being detected. Eliu means quick and nimble, and whenever Eliu moved, he was so quick that he disappeared and was untraceable. Moloa means lazy, but when he appeared to be lazing or sleeping, his spirit would emerge and he would go around the island doing good deeds for others, whilst he just appeared to be snoozing. There are theories that the Menehune were the first people of Hawaii, and in 1820, 65 people were listed in the census as Menehune as their race. We know that the Polynesians got there around 1000 AD, but did they bring the Menehune with them to the islands? Well, in 2003, a skeleton was found in Indonesia of a 3.5 foot humanoid that most likely existed with other humans around 100,000 years ago. So the idea of these smaller humanoids called Homo floresiensis might have been the first inspiration, or maybe the first Menehune altogether. It makes sense from Indonesia, as this is another kind of Pacific and Polynesian inspired culture, and we can totally see the influence of these islands on the wider Polynesian culture throughout history. Now, for our mythical comparison, the one I'm immediately thinking of for this monster is the Duende, a dwarven fae creature from Iberian, Latin American and Filipino folklore. They fit into the forest-dwelling, nature-loving dwarven creatures, but are also slightly more mischievous. I am yet to cover these, but I will be doing so soon. And of course, naturally, we have to point towards the Norse dwarves. Because of their natural craftsmanship and their short stature, they also generally made things for themselves, but would sometimes help out with other races. Whilst we're on the subjects of races that can come from Lord of the Rings, hobbits also may have been inspired by the Menehune, and whilst these are fictional creatures that were made up by Tolkien, it's definitely interesting to see that 3.5 foot humanoid that might have lived within New Zealand and within those Polynesian cultures that Lord of the Rings was set in. It's absolutely fascinating, and we will be covering hobbits at some point as a Tolkien-esque mythology creature. Now, speaking of Lord of the Rings, let's move on to modern media. There isn't really anything on the Menehune themselves that I could find. However, I filled this up with dwarven, little people, fae folklore bits, and some Pacific mythology to fill that space up. For art, there's not really much for these at all, I'm afraid to say, even on the independent art front. Although that is where I will point you for images of these fellas. The ones I could find were really great and actually really sweet as well. In movies, we have Moana, Island of the Menehune, Suicide Squad, The Dark Crystal, Superman and the Mole People, Willow, Huli, Men in Black, The Phantom Planet, The Wizard of Oz, Meet Dave, Flight of the Navigator, Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and The Bride of Frankenstein. For TV, we have Finding Bigfoot, Blake 7, The Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power, Steven Universe, Amphibia, The Collector, Doctor Who, The Twilight Zone, Dead Time Stories, Strawberry Shortcake, Mighty Max, Hilda, Gravity Falls, Futurama, Love, Death and Robots, Men in Black, The Simpsons, Thundercats, The World of David the Gnome, South Park, The Smurfs, SpongeBob SquarePants, and Kabuto Plop. In video games, we have ones such as Pandora's Box, Pokemon, Tomodachi Life, Kingdom Hearts, Insignificant 2019, Gourmet Warriors, Adventure Quest, Overwatch, Smite, Arcanum, Warcraft, League of Legends, Final Fantasy 11 and 14, EverQuest, Dark Chronicle, Arknights, Grand Blue Fantasy, and World of Warcraft. My book recommendation this week is for Hawaiian Myths of the Earth, Sea and Sky by Vivian LeBuck Thompson for the adults who want to learn more about this amazing mythology and mythos. And for the kids, there is actually a Menehune book which I really recommend. It's called The Menehune of Nauapaka Village by Christopher Sir, for this gorgeously illustrated story about the Menehune specifically. But now it's time for Do I Think They Existed? You know what? I think there might be a possibility for this one. I love the idea of these secret dwarves who run around and build things for people in the night for just prawns. I respect and appreciate it in all honesty. I also think that this creature is so important to the local heritage and culture of Hawaii, and is so embedded within their folklore, which was taken away by European settlers. And who am I to take away from them any more than my ancestors already have? With the Europeans and their love for this monster, so much so that they thought they'd built these amazing structures, shows how much they didn't believe that native Hawaiians could do this and show this much skill in stonemasonry themselves, and so much that they had to attribute it to a mythical beast instead, which is utterly sad, but totally not unexpected from ancient old blokes who never learned another language, let alone how to build a structure like that beautiful pond. But long story short, I think they're believable, because they are smaller and they are secretive. Have we looked through the whole Hawaiian forest for them? No, and I don't think we should go looking for them. Long may they tinker about in their own time. I will also put into this section that I'm aware my pronunciation of Hawaiian words is not the best. I'm not from any Polynesian country, there's very little info on how to pronounce things, and I don't have any friends in Hawaii. I mean, we can change that if you're interested, but do please forgive me for my pronunciation and don't quote me on any of them. But what do you think? Did the Menehune build some of the most amazing structures of Hawaii? Let me know on Twitter, I would love to know what you think about this one. I loved looking at this monster this week. It was so nice to look into a different mythos, and I'm always thrilled to find that I've discovered a new one for myself and learned something new about a different place, and I hope you did too. I've always enjoyed and loved Hawaii and the wider Polynesian culture and folklore, so it was a joy to learn more about this one this week. Next week though, we're heading over to Thailand for the first time in a little while, and looking at a great and pretty frightening ghost, the Krahang. Look out for a man in a loincloth flying at you next Thursday when I'm properly back home. For now though, thank you so much for listening. It's been an absolute pleasure. If you enjoyed this podcast, please give it a rating on the service you are listening on. I've got the Twitter for any questions or suggestions on what monsters to cover next, and I'd really love to hear from you. The social media handles for TikTok, YouTube, Threads and Instagram are Myth Monsters Podcast, and the Twitter is Myth Monsters Pod. But all of our content can be found at mythmonsters.co.uk, including some very cool merchandise. You can also find us on Good Pods, Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon if you want to help me fund the podcast too. Come join the fun though, share this with your pals, they might love me as much as you do, But for now, stay spooky, and I'll see you later, babes.